Hi, I want to talk about the two mechanisms that we use to control the amount of light entering the camera. And the first is called the shutter. And the shutter on cameras of this sort, SLRs, the shutter is located in the body of the camera, at the back of the camera. So this window here is the shutter. This is a film camera. So you can't open the back of a digital camera to see this. But here with the film camera you can. So the shutter is this window here, and the shutter opens and closes. And so with it you can control the length of time that light is allowed into the camera. So the shutter settings are called shutter speeds, and they're described in seconds and in fractions of seconds. So I want to show you some of the different shutter speeds so you have a sense of what happens. In an earlier lecture we discussed what happens when you take a picture, and we said that the reflex mirror pops up out of the way, allowing light to pass directly into the camera, and the shutter opens, which allows the light to pass all the way back into the body of the camera to this area, which is the film plane and also the digital sensor plane on digital cameras. So I'm going to show you a few of the different shutter speeds. The first is actually not a number but a letter, the letter B, which stands for bulb. And in the bulb setting you can keep the shutter open for as long as you want. So if you've seen images made at night of cars passing through and you see streaks of light, or images of the sky with the stars appearing to move, those images were made with long exposures where the shutter stays open for a long period of time. And for however long you have the shutter open, whatever's going on in front of the camera will be recorded. And if there's motion, then that motion will be recorded. The bulb setting allows you to keep the shutter open for as long as you want. So just open that up and you can see that the shutter is open, and it will stay open for as long as I have my finger on the shutter release button. Or what most people use is something a little easier, and that is called a cable release. Either a physical one that you screw into the camera or an electronic one, which is kind of like a remote control. So after the bulb setting, the shutter speeds are described in seconds and in fractions of seconds. So this is 1 second. Let's turn it around again. 1 second. Seems longer than that, doesn't it? 1 Mississippi. We were taught to use the word Mississippi for 1 second. Maybe you learned something else. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Anyway, that's 1 second. And this is half a second, a quarter of a second. And you can hear that the period of time is shorter. And what you're actually hearing is the sound of the reflex mirror moving up and down. The shutter itself is silent, or essentially silent. 1/8 of a second. 1/15 of a second. Now it's getting hard to see that it's moving. Let's see. 1/30th of a second. 1/60th of a second. And so these are fractions of seconds. On your camera, you'll probably just have whole numbers written. So here you can see, of course it's upside down, 60, 15, 30, 15, 8, and so on. But they're actually fractions with a 1 over it. Okay, so 1/125th of a second. 1/250th of a second. And now it's getting hard to see that it's moving at all. Let's see. Yeah, not much point now, but that was a 500th of a second, And you can see the reflex mirror popping out of the way for a sec too, kind of. So this camera has a maximum speed of 1/2000th of a second. Other cameras have faster shutter speeds. This digital camera here, my SLR, has a maximum shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second, which is really fast. And that's about the fastest shutter speed that you'll find on cameras with mechanical shutters, because beyond that, they just can't open and close quickly enough. But the maximum shutter speed that a camera has doesn't necessarily imply its quality. Not that this isn't a fine camera, it is. But this camera is not a particularly good camera, but it has a fairly fast maximum shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second. But there are some cameras, some high-end medium format cameras that only have a maximum shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. So it doesn't necessarily correlate. Okay. So those are the shutter speeds, and I want to talk about them specifically. So I'm going to go over to, I hope this works, my screen. And these notes are in the modules, in the Canvas module entitled Aperture and Shutter. So I want to go over them. All right. So again, the shutter controls the length of time that light is allowed into the camera. And the shutter speeds are described in seconds and in fractions of seconds. So I've written out these numbers here, and these are the shutter speeds that we just looked at. And these are what are called the whole stop numbers. All cameras have these shutter speeds. Some of them have shutter speeds beyond 1/2000th of a second, as we discussed. And some cameras actually have preset shutter speeds that are longer than 1 second. But within those parameters, all cameras have these shutter speeds. However, many cameras also have intermediate shutter speeds, either of 1/2 increments or 1/3 stop increments. And that varies from camera to camera. But again, all cameras have these shutter speeds. So these are the ones I want you to learn. So 1 second, 1/2 a second, 1/4 of a second, 1/8 of a second. And then there's a little jump. Logically, you would expect the next shutter speed to be 1/16th of a second, but it isn't. It's 1/15th of a second. And then a 30th of a second, a 60th of a second, and then another little jump. Logically, the next shutter speed would be 1/120th of a second, but it isn't. It's 1/125th of a second. And then 1/250th, 1/500th, 1/1000th, 1/2000th, and so on. So you can see that the lower numbers, the denominators, double as you go along. But since they're fractions, the length of time is actually cut in half as you go down the line. And when you change the shutter speed from a slower shutter speed, for example, a second or 1/2 a second, to a faster speed or setting, to 1/4 of a second, 1/8 of a second, 1/15th of a second, and so on, you decrease the amount of light entering the camera by 1/2 per stop. So in general, as you change the shutter speed from a slower to a faster shutter speed, the length of time the shutter remains open decreases, and therefore the amount of light entering the camera decreases. Specifically, it decreases by 1/2 per setting or per stop. So if we look at these numbers here, if we change, for example, the shutter speed from a 30th of a second to a 60th of a second, we cut the amount of light in half. And it doesn't matter where you start. It could be at a 1/2 a second or a 1/2000th of a second. This rule holds true. When you change the shutter speed from a slower to a faster shutter speed, you decrease the amount of light entering the camera by 1/2. So I've changed the shutter speed from a 30th of a second to a 60th of a second. I cut the amount of light in half. If I then change the shutter speed from a 60th of a second to 1/125th of a second, I cut the light in half again. So I cut it in half, and I cut it in half again. So what I've done is something called stopping down or closing down, and I've done that by 2 stops. So a 30th of a second to a 60th of a second, and a 60th of a second to 1/125th of a second. And so overall, I have decreased the amount of light entering the camera to 1/4, to be 1/4 of what it had been at a 30th of a second. How do I know that? Well, a half of a half is 1/4. Or I can multiply these numbers. Don't worry, this is not a math class. But when you multiply fractions, if the numerators, the upper numbers, are the same, you just multiply the lower numbers, the denominators. So 2 times 2 is 4. So a half times a half is 1/4. And so 1/125th of a second lets in 1/4 as much light as 1/30th of a second does. If we again stop down by 1 stop to 1/250th of a second, we again cut the amount of light in half. And so I've cut the light in half, I cut it in half again, and I cut it in half again. So 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/4, times 1/2 is 1/8. So 1/250th of a second lets in 1/8 as much light as 1/30th of a second does. And if I again cut the amount of light in half, if I again stop down to 1/500th of a second, I again cut the amount of light in half. And a half times a half is a 1/4, times a half is an 1/8, times a half is 1/16. So 1/500th of a second lets in 1/16 as much light as a 30th of a second. So I've stopped down, in this case, by 4 stops. And we don't count the first one, our starting point. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And as I go along, if I want to continue to stop down, I will again cut the amount of light in half per stop. Okay. So put another way, if we take this circle as representing the total amount of light entering the camera at our starting point, which in our example is a 30th of a second. When we change the shutter speed from a, was it a 30th? I'm sorry, yep, 30th of a second, sorry about that. So when we change the shutter speed from a 30th of a second to a 60th of a second, we cut the amount of light in half, and we're left with 1/2. When we change from a 60th of a second to 1/125th of a second, we cut that half in half, and we're left with 1/4. When we cut the, when we stop down from 1/250th of a second, I'm getting myself all mixed up, am I not? 1/125th of a second to 1/250th of a second, we cut the quarter in half, and we're left with 1/8 of the total amount of light that we began with. When we stop down then from, I have to move it to check where I am, 1/250th of a second to 1/500th of a second, we again cut the amount of light in half, and we're left with 1/16. And if we stop down again, we'll be left with 1/32nd, and then 1/64th, and then 1/128th, and beyond that would be 1/256th, and then 1/512th, and so on. So each time you stop down, you cut the amount of light in half. In the opposite direction, when you change the shutter speed from a faster to a slower shutter speed, you increase the amount of light entering the camera by 2 times per stop. So in this case, we're changing the shutter speed from a faster to a slower shutter speed. And the longer the shutter remains open, the more light you allow in. So if 1/4000th of a second is half as long as 1/2000th of a second, then 1/2000th of a second is twice as long as 1/4000th of a second, and it therefore allows in twice as much light. And again, you can use any number as a starting point. So I've started here at 1/250th of a second. And if I open up, which is what it's called when you go from a faster to a slower shutter speed, or when you increase the amount of light entering the camera. So I've opened up by one stop. I've changed the shutter speed from 1/250th of a second to 1/125th of a second. And I have doubled the amount of light entering the camera, because 1/125th of a second is half the speed of 1/250th of a second. So it's twice as long, and it therefore allows in twice as much light. If I open up again from 1/125th of a second to 1/60th of a second, I again double the amount of light entering the camera. So now I've opened up by two stops, from 1/250th of a second to 1/125th of a second, and then to 1/60th of a second. I have now increased the amount of light entering the camera by 4 times. And I know that because, again, I can multiply these numbers, and 2 times 2 is 4. So 1/60th of a second lets in 4 times as much light as 1/250th of a second does. If I again open up from a 60th of a second to a 30th of a second, I again double the amount of light entering the camera. So now I have opened up by 3 stops, and 2 times 2 is 4 times 2 is 8. So a 30th of a second lets in 8 times as much light as 1/250th of a second. And if I again open up by another stop from a 30th of a second to 1/15th of a second, I again double the amount of light entering the camera, and I'm now allowing in 16 times as much light. So a 15th of a second lets in 16 times as much light as 1/250th of a second does. And again, it doesn't matter where I start, this rule holds true. So that's what happens when you change the shutter speed. You change the amount of time that the shutter remains open, and the amount of time that light is entering the camera. And again, this is the first of 2 mechanisms that we use to control the amount of light entering the camera. In the next video, we'll talk about the second mechanism.